because Norman Geisler said that. And I specifically discussed the difference between a fallen will, an enslaved will, and an autonomous will. I talked in categories of creature of the will. But see, once you collapse everything down and you will not allow meaningful categories to exist that allow communication to take place, then you can make all sorts of accusations of contradiction. Now, sadly, Brother Tassi would find himself hoisted on his own petard if he were to ever attempt to defend the deity of Christ, the two natures of Christ, any other element of meaningful Christian theology, the whole concept of the atonement, things like that, require the utilization of categories. And I have a feeling that Brother Tassi would use those categories. But when it comes to dealing with Calvinism, well, we don't have to extend that grace to someone else, but we'll demand it of ourselves when we get around to discussing these other issues. This leads to a level of incoherence and inconsistency that, again, should cause the follower of Christ to recoil in horror if we're being forced to consider whether we want to glorify God by our consistency or dishonor him by our inconsistency. That really becomes part of the question.
Then he goes on to say, God frees the will so that people can believe. Really?
Yes, really. Really, that's exactly what I said. Because, again, that makes perfect sense in the context in which I said it. And in the context it allows for man's will to be a creaturely will, for there to be a new creature in Christ, for there to be freedom from sin and bondage and all of those things, which are biblical teachings. It makes perfect sense there. It's only within a universe where you have decided that these other necessary categories cannot exist that it becomes at all problematic. And you just have to understand that wasn't my presentation. So what you're saying is, well, if you accept my boiled down presentation, then his makes no sense. Well, yeah. That's exactly right. But your boiled down presentation likewise would not allow you to defend pretty much almost anything else you believe. I'm not sure if you've ever been pressed to think about that before.
So God freed the will so that man can choose? No, they don't believe that. But if it's played carefully, it sounds pretty good. And it's just a logical fallacy. Either there's no free will or there is. Come on.
Now, I hope you're catching this now. Free will equals autonomous will. No other category is allowed. Creaturely will, nothing. It's just not allowed. It's part and parcel of everything that has ever been written on this. But it's not allowed. Can't have it.
God's will, the very term God's will, presupposes that there's other wills than God's. We wouldn't even have a term God's will, doing God's will, if there was no other will in the universe, like they claim. And they play this game of free will. They'll start to say, well, we don't have free will, but we have volition. Now, if you study forensics of any kind, if you've ever seen Law and Order or CSI...
Okay, now, I did... I was writing when I was listening to this. I wrote inside today, but I fired this up at the beginning of a Zwift ride inside. Killer ride, man. Anyway, and despite the fact that my heart rate was rather elevated at that point, I did manage to chuckle. That at one point I've been accused of relying upon natural theology, and now to define will, we're going to CSI. Yeah, okay. I felt like saying it depends on which CSI series we're talking about here, because I sense some differences between them. But anyway, there you go.
Crime show. What does volition mean? Well, it just means that you were acting based on the causing of someone else. And what happens in a trial? In fact, the district attorney will come to the criminal that's committed the crime And he'll say, if you give up someone else, we'll give you a break. And the worst a person could be charged with in Calvinism for their evil would be involuntary manslaughter. You couldn't have done other than what God decreed for you to do. And the truth is, Calvinism on Trial, going to be another title of a video I do. You put Calvinism on trial, and the worst you could be charged for in your evil, if you murdered someone, if you raped someone, the worst you could be charged for is involuntary manslaughter in Calvinism. Because everything's caused by God. You don't have a free will. In fact, James White, he says, if evil is not caused by God, there's no meaning behind evil. Oh, really, James White? You can't think of meaning behind evil that you did in your life unless God caused it?
What I actually said, of course, is that I do not believe there is any such thing as meaningless evil. And if God is not sovereign over man's evil, and if God does not have a decree, then there is such thing as meaningless evil. That God, knowing it would exist, purposefully brought into existence a universe where his law would be violated to no end, for no purpose. That is what I was talking about. And evidently that's what Brother Tassi believes, is that though God knew, because I have specifically heard him say he rejects open theism. Good. Even though that's the only consistent Arminianism, he rejects it. Good. So from his perspective, when God created, he knew every act of evil that was going to exist, but he had no purpose for it. So he brought all this into existence, all the evil. God created it, knew it was going to happen, could have stopped it, but chose not to for no purpose, because there's no purpose to it. That's what you're defending. That's the incoherence of the argument being presented. Sadly, almost never are these folks actually challenged to recognize that by affirming God's knowledge of the existence of all evil acts and then removing from him the sovereign freedom to have a purpose in these acts, you have to affirm that God brought these things into existence, and he did so specifically without any purpose.